Are there certain intellectual or religious ideas that are a prerequisite for a successful culture or civilization? So, this is a really interesting question to me. And it's a question that was spurred on in my mind, spurred on in my, it's a question that I had after watching this conversation between Richard Dawkins and Jordan Peterson, specifically because of a comment that Jordan Peterson makes in this conversation. And it's a question I say that it's interesting because I want to say my immediate reaction is to say that it's wrong just because of how the question is situated and because at first glance to me anyways, and I want to hear y'all's response to this, especially in the chat. It's just on the surface wrong, and it's on the surface not how I would approach history and not really how I would approach philosophy, but I've been thinking about it a lot. The question has been living rent free in my head, as my high school students would say. So I decided to make a video about it. And if you're watching this, you're probably familiar with both Dawkins and Peterson. Maybe you're even a fan of one or both of these people. And I found this conversation kind of frustrating on a few levels, mostly because they just kind of and to be fair, I didn't watch the entire thing. I watched like the first hour and a half, I believe it was, first hour. I can't remember exactly how long it was, but they spent most of the time talking past one another. And so it's probably frustrating if you're a Peterson fan or if you're a Dawkins fan or if you're somebody like me who's not really a fan of either one of these people. Although we'll kind of get into that because I do think that Peterson actually raised some really good points here, and I can't believe I'm saying that, especially on a video. But they spent most of it kind of talking past each other. But what stood out to me was this question of cultural Christianity, broadly construed, whether or not ideas or religious ideas. Peterson is going to make the argument that religious ideas, Christian ideas, are a prerequisite for a successful culture, whatever that means. It's Peterson, so we're not really going to get a clear definition or outlining of any of these terms. But if you've seen any Peterson videos, that's probably what you can come to expect. But yeah, this idea stood out to me, and I want to explore this idea because I think it reveals something that I see a lot in kind of common everyday talk, especially about history and kind of these bold, grand historical statements that people tend to make, statements that on a surface level would appear to be true or appear to have like credible evidence, but general broad statements about history, even if they might sound convincing or sound solid, are almost never true. As we'll kind of dig into that, and I'll kind of explain that platitude I just kind of laid out. But I want to go ahead and start the video, and I'm going to start it around the 28-minute mark. And up until this point, they've been having and from my opinion, a rather frustrating conversation about truth and about the nature of truth. And as we'll see, Dawkins is really pushing for this very, I would say, limited, narrow definition or understanding of truth, that science is the only discipline or only fact finding enterprise that has a claim to truth, although he spends zero time laying out what the criteria for scientific truth would be or relating scientific truth to other types of truth. And Peterson, coming from the more psychoanalytical background, psychology background, psychotherapy background, but also because of his interest in mythology, and religion, is going to suggest that there are other sorts of truth. This conversation is enlightening. I don't know if it's enlightening is not the right word. This conversation is illuminating, really because of the need. It should show us the need to approach these conversations with very clear definitions, because both Peterson and Dawkins get started off on two very different feet. And because of that, they're going to spend this whole time just, like I said before, just the talking past each other. It would really have benefited, and maybe this should have fallen on Alex. I'm not sure what Alex O'Connor is the one I believe that hosted this conversation. I think it would have behooved Alex to help to set those standard definitions and understandings before the conversation got started to kind of prevent all of this. But nevertheless, we've got some, this is where my question comes from. So I'm going to go ahead and start the video.
You made a statement a couple of months ago that I found very interesting. And I don't claim to understand it, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot with it. You said that you were a cultural Christian. Okay, and so that raised a number of questions in my mind. And the first question was,
you are changing the subject.
No, I'm not. No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I may be leaping outside of the topic a bit to get back to it.
Cultural Christian.
So they've been having this conversation about truth, and then Peterson wants to bring the conversation to some statements. This video, I think, is about 2 or 3 months old at the time of me recording this. Back early in 2024, Dawkins made the statement that he was a cultural Christian. He had a conversation with, I believe, a news reporter on Easter, if I'm not mistaken, talking about the value of Christianity as a cultural institution, of course, over and against that of Islam. I believe I made a video on that. I've made a video on Richard Dawkins talking about his being a cultural Christian. So like I said before, this is Peterson kind of trying to redirect the conversation because Dawkins has been talking exclusively of truth within the context of science, scientific truth, and has been trying to press Peterson on whether or not he thinks these biblical claims are true. And again, it's not quite certain what Dawkins means by that. Is he asking Peterson if the claims of the Bible are scientifically true? That's a complete anachronistic question. The Bible is not a science textbook, so we would need more clarification from Dawkins about that. And Peterson's kind of pushback or redirect, however you want to phrase that, is to talk about the cultural validity or cultural truth of intellectual traditions, of religious traditions. And again, the focus here is going to be on Christianity over and against. We won't really cover this part of the conversation, but Christianity over and against other religious systems, other religious institutions, again, especially Islam.
Referring to the predictive power and to the utility of the stories.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's actually what I was trying to zero in on. Okay, so that was the point. Well, it seemed to me that your proclamation that you were a cultural Christian was a recognition and a statement that you had found something in the culture that had been derived from Christianity that you had an affinity with, and that there's some reason for that. And one of the things I wanted to ask you is, well, what do you think that Christianity got right that allows you to make a statement like that? I mean, I know that there's differences perhaps in what we both think about the ultimate veracity of the biblical stories. Maybe there isn't differences. Like, it would take a lot of conversation to figure this out. But what did you mean by that? Like, what do you think that Christianity got right that would enable you to make a statement like that?
Virtually nothing.
All right, so this is part of Peterson's pushback. What is it about Christianity that you find valuable? And I think he could have gone further with this because, as we'll see later on in the conversation, Dawkins does see value in Christianity. And maybe he doesn't want to put that under the same umbrella as truth, but he does think that Christianity got some things right that other religious traditions did not get right. So I think Peterson could have went a lot further on that point to kind of explore Dawkins's biases that he obviously has here with Christianity. But what Peterson is getting at is that his understanding of truth, I think, I don't want to put words in his mouth, and of course, Dr. Peterson, you're always more than welcome to come chat with me. I can't believe that would ever happen or that you would even see any of these videos. But I think what Peterson is saying is true here, that one of his understandings of the nature of truth, his kind of epistemological claim, would be more in line with the school of pragmatism of William James. That would make a lot of sense because James is coming from a psychology background, but that what makes something true has a lot to do with its utility, especially its utility for the individual. And so we have here a statement of the truth or the validity of Christianity predicated on its predictive value or its utilitarian value for the individual on the one level, and then the larger, bigger claim here would be the value of Christianity for the culture. the culture which adopts Christianity. So what exactly does Dawkins mean by this whole cultural Christianity thing?
I meant by that no more than that I'm brought up in a Christian culture. I went to Christian schools. I therefore know my way around the Bible. I know my way around the Book of Common Prayer. I know the hymns. That's all. I don't value Christianity as a truth system at all.
So I wanted to cover part of this conversation on truth because I think it sets up the larger point and larger conversation that Peterson's going to make about like cultural truth, for lack of a better word. But I also want to stay a little bit on the statement that Dawkins just made, because I think he's not being, I don't want to say honest here. Maybe he's just not being very insightful to his own claims, because one of the entire reasons why they're having this conversations is because of what Dawkins had previously said in 2024 about being a cultural Christian. And then in this conversation, he says, I don't value Christianity as a truth system at all. But that statement is just not true. And it's not true based on what Dawkins has said about Christianity, because he does value Christian traditions. He does value the Christian stories. He does value Christian morality, like I said before, over and against other stories, other values, other religious traditions. So for him to make that blanket statement, unless he's going to walk back everything that he has said in the previous year, which in this interview he does not, that statement just isn't true. And I don't know if Dawkins just doesn't see that or doesn't want to admit it. But as I've pointed out in other videos, there's this, and I haven't been able to pinpoint this. And if you can help me articulate it, I would really appreciate it. I had a conversation with a friend of mine, Jared, who's been on this channel quite a few times recently. And I guess I'm trying to understand the motive for Dawkins here. Maybe it's just a grift. I'm not sure. But if you can help me kind of unpack this a little bit. Dawkins' emphasis on Christianity and Christian values and of the importance of Christianity for British culture specifically, I think is revealing some is revealing an underlying conservatism that kind of political conservatism, cultural conservatism that runs throughout Dawkins's thought. Even though Dawkins' claim to fame, his rise to fame was with the whole New Atheist movement, his pushback against Christianity, he's pushing back against the Christian claims about the natural world and pushing back against the claims of Christianity that might overlap with scientific claims. But what he's not pushing back against and what he actually accepts is the aspect of Christianity that has to do more with the political side of things, that an aspect of Christianity that's actually may or may not be a part of the religious tradition itself, but is more so a part of the Christian cultural tradition that we see in the UK and in the United States especially. And that's this linking of Christianity with conservative values and conservative political belief. And when I say conservative here, I'm not talking about the US distinction between liberal and conservative. I mean the kind of philosophical conservatives, the conservatives that are seeking to maintain and uphold and to keep intact the culture that they're coming from. And that's exactly what we see with Dawkins. But again, maybe he's just not, I don't want to say not self-aware. Maybe he's just not aware of his own biases here. Maybe he just doesn't want to talk about the political angle. But that does seem to be where he's coming from. I'm more than happy to be wrong about that. My confusion is, why isn't he saying that? And the only reason why I can think why he's not saying that is to keep up this air of, well, I'm coming from a scientific perspective and I don't value any sort of truth outside of science. But I don't know. Let me know what you think about that. It's really confusing for me. And I think it's something that's worth understanding as we see this kind of cultural shift that's happening, because a lot of people, not just Dawkins, but a lot of people in the manosphere I believe is what they're calling it. A lot of people in the intellectual dark web. We're seeing these sorts of similar conversations where we want to make the conversation about science, or we want to make the conversation about history, but that's not really what we're talking about. What we're really talking about is like a political belief system that we're not going to identify, and instead we're going to frame it as, no, this is a historical point, or no, this is a scientific point. Anyway, so Peterson kind of pushes back against Dawkins, asking him, well, what exactly about Christianity do you value? Dawkins is going to turn the table to Peterson. Well, what makes Christianity valuable? And Peterson is going to run with this sort of cultural explanation why Christianity is valued. Well, he doesn't specify, but we'll get into that. He doesn't specify Christianity, but he indirectly talks about Christianity, why Christianity is important culturally speaking.
As I said before, there are elements of the text that I don't feel qualified to comment on. My experience has been that the more, I know from a metaphorical perspective and from a mythic perspective what the story of the virgin birth means, and I accept that. I know, for example, that any culture that doesn't hold the image of the woman and infant sacred dies. And I don't know how that needs to be expressed in a form.
Okay, that is a wild, wild statement. And that statement is why I made this video. So I had to write it down to make sure I'm using Peterson's exact words here. Any culture that doesn't hold the image of the woman and infant sacred dies. Now, I'm going to make a lot of assumptions in my interpretation. If you feel like you understand what Peterson is talking about, by all means, feel free to clarify, and feel free to push back on my interpretation here. But I find this statement problematic on so many levels, and it befuddles. It really confuses me why Dawkins didn't say, like, what does that mean? Like, tell me more about that. Dawkins just wants to keep pushing his understanding of truth. But if I was having a conversation with Peterson, like, I could have a conversation with Peterson just about that single statement, probably for a few hours to figure out what that even means. But I'll tell you why I think it's problematic. And again, I want to hear what you think about this sort of statement. Okay, so the first thing I think is problematic is the vagueness of the language. This is a common problem with Peterson, where we just make these grand overarching claims that vaguely sound familiar or probable or true for the individual, but there's a lot of words in that statement that need to be expanded on and unpacked a lot. First and foremost, any culture, that word culture is doing a lot of work for the statement. What exactly do we mean by culture? Is culture here synonymous with civilization? Are we saying that any civilization that doesn't hold the image of the woman and the child sacred doesn't survive? And the problem with a word like culture, just if you take some time to stop and think about it, identify a particular culture. So have a culture. What is the first thing you think of when you think of a culture? Maybe you think of like ancient Egypt. Maybe you think of, I was going to say American culture. Do Americans have a culture? There are certain cultural aspects of American life that have influenced, that have a really big influence. Different conversation for a different day. Think of like British culture, Victorian culture, but that's the problem, right? So even with that last statement I made, think of like Victorian culture. Culture is a convenient label that we use big picture to identify, loosely speaking, a time period that we're talking about. But culture is not in history, in anthropology, in archaeology. Culture is not a definitive category. Think for a second about when one culture begins and ends. If we're going to say something like American culture, like maybe when I have a lot of international students and I ask them what they like, I like to ask them what they think American culture is. A lot of them will say like Hollywood, because that's what the big import the American cultural import to a lot of other nations is the film, the movies, the TV shows, and stuff like that we produce. So if we go with that understanding, like, when does American culture begin? Does it begin with Hollywood itself, the city being founded? Does it begin with the first motion pictures that were produced? Can we start it with a singular motion picture that was incredibly popular for an international audience? And when does it end? Obviously, Hollywood's still there. They're putting out movies, but it's impossible to create a definite start and end date because the word culture is so nebulous. Even more so when you're talking about ancient cultures. When does ancient Egyptian culture start and when does it end? That culture, we can say, as like a continuous culture in terms of shared beliefs, values, religious institutions, lasted for quite some time, maybe a few thousand years. But it changes over the course of that time. It changes. The ancient Egyptian civilization changed governments. It went through different periods of economic productivity, for lack of a better word, different periods of political regime changes, of expansion and contraction in terms of the political dynamics of ancient Egypt. But the word culture doesn't have set definitive parameters. So the first thing that we need to do is clarify, well, what do we mean by culture? The second part of that statement, that holds the woman and the infant sacred, who are we talking about? Mary and Jesus? That's my first assumption. Is there some other woman and infant that we're holding sacred? I mean, a lot of different religious traditions have women that they hold sacred and have infants maybe that they hold sacred, but it seems like we're talking about Jesus, right? But we do need some clarification there. And then there's the word sacred. Well, what do we mean by sacred? Do we mean like veneration? Do we mean worship? Are we holding these images as divine? Right? Let's expand on that a little bit. But I think the word culture is particularly problematic with that. Well, it sounds like something that we have a grasp on, but with most things in history, this big picture label, once we start examining it through the microscope of history, it soon dissolves. These aren't definitive categories. And that leads me to my second problem with this statement, is that big, sweeping, overarching claims like this, when applied to history, are almost never true. And the reason why they're almost never true, almost never, I'm just going to say never true, is because history is extraordinarily complex. Let's go back to that cultural example. What exactly is ancient Egyptian culture? There are so many different things that you can look at. You can look at the religious tradition. You can look at the writing, the hieroglyphics. You can look at the buildings that they constructed. You can look at how kind of Egyptian society was organized by class, by income. You can look at the role of the pharaoh. It is so complex, even just choosing a particular time and place. Even if you were just going to examine a singular historical event, even if you're going to look at something like the terrorist attacks of September 11th, there is so much context that you have to take into consideration. And the problem with big, bold statements like this, and the reason why I say they're almost never true, is because what would it take to refute a statement like this? A counterexample, to say, well, here's an example in which this did not happen, or here's an example in which this was not the case. And with history, you're going to always be able to find a counterexample for big, bold claims. Whether these are like historiographical claims or general claims about a particular historical time period. So, like, for example, when people say history is written by the victors, do we have evidence of non-victors writing history? Do we have sources from non-victors? Can we examine if there's a situation in which one civilization goes to war with another civilization and completely wipes them out, so to speak? Do we have evidence from that civilization that was wiped out? Of course we do. But yeah, you can always think of counterexamples. So the big problem here is that statements like this are too vague to be historically meaningful in any significant way. It's just a general statement. It may sound nice, but once we start looking at actual history, its meaningfulness just falls apart. It's just rambling. It doesn't mean anything. It's not really applicable to any historical situation. So, to illustrate this point, what would it take to prove that statement wrong? Again, that statement being any culture that does not hold the image of the mother and the infant sacred dies. So let me make some assumptions here. First and foremost, I'm going to assume that Peterson is talking about Christianity and he's talking about the image of Mary and Jesus. And then by culture, I think we can take a loose definition and say that it's applying to something like ancient Egypt or ancient Rome or ancient Greece or America or UK or whatever. I think the motive for him saying this has a lot to do with the current political climate. I'm going to completely ignore that and just take a very broad understanding of what he means by culture here. So your Jeopardy question for today: what was the first civilization that adopted Christianity on like a institutional national level? What was the first nation that became overtly Christian and adopted Christian beliefs, practices, and Christian culture? The answer to that question, of course, is Roman civilization, the conversion of the Emperor Constantine. Is Roman culture still around? The answer to that question would be, again, depends on what you mean by culture. The Romans have undoubtedly influenced modern European society in many different ways. Their legal institution, especially, kind of lived on throughout various different civilizations. But the Roman Empire fell. Rome, in terms of ancient Rome, doesn't exist anymore. Roman culture, in terms of their values and beliefs, don't exist today as they did back then. So, in a very meaningful way, Roman culture does not exist anymore. So, here we have a concrete counterexample of a civilization that did hold the mother and the infant sacred and that still died. But we can think of other counterexamples. Were there counterexamples of cultures which had no sacred imagery of the mother and the infant, and yet were still successful? Again, whatever successful means in this context. And I'm going to again assume that he's talking about Christianity. What were some of the longest lasting civilizations in history? What were the civilizations in which, loosely speaking, their culture and their civilization survived the longest? Well, we have some very big examples of this. Ancient Egyptian civilization, which I've already mentioned, lasts for somewhere around like 3,000 years. Don't quote me on the exact number. It lasts a really long time. We can look at ancient Mesopotamian civilization as our second example. We can look at ancient Chinese civilization. Ancient Chinese civilization, probably one of the longest continuing civilizations. Again, that word civilization is very nebulous, very ethereal, very vague, but bear with me for the sake of this example. Chinese civilization, in terms of the written records and documents that we've produced, in terms of the various religious traditions that they've had that survived, again, roughly 3,000 years. Were any of these civilizations overtly Christian? No, they weren't. And yet they lasted longer than other civilizations that did hold the image of the mother and the infant sacred. So the statement, as far as I'm concerned, is historically speaking just meaningless. I'm not sure what Peterson's referring to. Again, maybe this hinges largely on how we're defining these words and how we're interpreting these terms. Let me know what you think, but those are my general thoughts. Do you find this statement meaningful? Can you help me to make sense of what Peterson was saying? Let me know, and I will see you all next time. Thank you.